Hi, everyone. It's Barb Egan with TherapyTalks. And on today's show, we have Evan Lieberman from Minneapolis. And Evan is an addiction specialist. He works in all sorts of areas and talks about how addictions can permeate all areas. And as therapists, we're going to see it, even though most of us can shy away from it. So today we talk about, where does it come from? Where does addiction come from? What does therapy do? How does therapy actually help? And the stoplight model, to be very practical, whether it's addiction and alcohol, or it can be applied to anxiety and OCD. And so I think no matter where you're at or who you know, you're going to resonate with today's show. So tell us a little bit about you, your practices in Minnesota. How did you get into therapy?
Yeah, I guess like the long and short of it, kind of the story I tell when people ask is, my mom worked with special needs. And so growing up, I would, volunteer, I would work and do programs, doing one-on-one with kids with behavioral intervention. And I guess I went into college and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. It was kind of like, I don't know, do I go like the business route like my dad, or do I go like more into like the human services route? But I kind of found I was more interested in human psychology, helping other people, kind of found I had a knack for talking to other people, and people would like kind of lean on me for support and advice, which I don't understand because I was a hot mess, but like apparently I was good at like listening and giving advice.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I was always attracted to that. So I was going in that direction in college, like studying psychology, but then I had some of my own personal issues with addictions. Basically, I developed a nasty addiction by the time I was, 19, 20, 21. And as I finally kind of got into recovery, I redirected a little bit and went towards the addiction route. But I always was interested in the general mental health piece of it as well. I was always very interested in both. And given my experiences in addiction, I thought, well, it would kind of be a shame to not use that or develop those. And it's a well-needed area for practitioners. So it was kind of second nature to go into addiction as well. And then, so that's kind of the background of how I got to where I am. And I guess right now, what my life consists of is, I have for the last like 6 years, I've had a private practice in one way or another, seeing people, individuals, families, adolescents, for individual therapy. I've worked in all sorts of different settings, like for many years, like inpatient psych units, treatment centers, outpatients, harm reduction. So I've kind of had a little bit of a wide breadth of experience working in different areas, but I think my, passion and what I've always wanted to do is that individual psychotherapy private practice. So I have my own group practice that I've been starting. That's all online, where I'm bringing clinicians on. So a lot of my time is spent managing that. I have a recovery housing program.
Wow.
So I'm, oversee that as well. So, and then I do social media content creation in the mental health and addiction space. So it's kind of like those three things. But I still like to kind of keep my feet on the ground and do direct services and work directly with clients. And I think it helps with everything I do. And it's just something that I love to do, even though I maybe don't necessarily need to do it, but I think it's important and I enjoy doing it. So I do part-time private practice compared to other clinicians who are saying 30 clients a week or something.
Right. Yeah.
There. But I also supervise new clinicians. So, the people who I bring on, a lot of them are supervisees. So I have my fingers in a lot of things, and it keeps it fresh.
It does. It absolutely does. I'm a university clinical supervisor too. So we have our interns, we have our graduate students, we have our practicing therapists that we supervise. I have a group practice too. And it's so fun to almost coach and mentor in that sense, as well as that individual, that client-centered psychotherapy, like you said, which in addictions is really unique because oftentimes you're at treatment facilities or it can look a little bit different. And I loved how you shared just how you work not only with individuals, but families, and a little bit of all of that. And the social media part of just bringing awareness and psychoeducation around that to those spaces that I bet more people than we realize resonate with. So in working with addiction, for our listeners listening on, could you describe what is addiction? Where does it come from? And then kind of some of those processes or treatment approaches to that.
Those are some pretty big questions, right?
Yeah.
Addiction. I think like the easiest, I don't know if I've ever like quantified this, but as far as a clinical psychological perspective, it's when somebody's use of mind and mood altering substances creates ongoing and pervasive consequences in their life. And so it really spans a spectrum because the people who you see for chemical health, and if you're a therapist, you cannot avoid it. You will have addiction will be an issue. And for some people, they go through it's periodic, right? I mean, especially right now, I've seen this I can't even count how many times that during the pandemic, they were always like kind of drinkers, but then it became an issue because it became a negative stress coping response. And then they found that it was negatively impacting them, their families, their relationships, right? And so for those guys, sometimes it's just kind of getting them back on track, right? These aren't necessarily lifetime chronic relapsing, the disease model that we have. And I think with addiction, that's where people's heads go right away, is this chronically relapsing condition of the brain that requires intervention, whatever. There's absolutely that. And of course, you're going to see a lot of those folks because they need help and they're going to seek services, or services will be sought for them.
Right.
Placed it into your lap, unbeknownst to them. But so it really spans like a very wide spectrum. And there's a lot of different ways to look at addiction, to intervene, to work with folks with addiction. So I think it spans anything from, working on people's goals to manage their term uses chemical health, which is a term I actually really like, because everybody has a relationship to substances in some way, whether that's I don't use them, or everyone has some certain boundaries. Okay, I drink, maybe once in a while I go overboard, but I'm not doing cocaine and I'm not doing heroin, right? Your average person. That would be a boundary for them. Someone comes and offers me a little heroin at the party, I'm going to say no. I'm going to do the Nancy Reagan on that one. So everybody has a relationship with chemicals, and it's different, and everybody has different goals, and everybody has different standards for themselves as well. Whether it's someone who let's say was addicted or is addicted to heroin and like living on the streets, their goals are probably going to be very different than, the person walking into my office because they're having relationship discord at home, right? So it's very complicated.
So what I'm hearing you say, it's a bit of a spectrum. Would you say that?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah. So it's a very wide spectrum, and people don't, I think, often realize that, because you look at addiction. You say, okay, well, if it's an issue, it's probably a very big issue. And everybody knows somebody where addiction was a very big issue and potentially had a devastating impact. So that's obviously where your mind is going to go to. And I think that's difficult sometimes for people to see. And I think it creates a lot of confusion because we look at it very much as a binary. And I could give like a little anecdote where I have a friend who's a lawyer, and he started referring me folks to get assessments, right? And when he sent me people, he basically, lawyers are, a little bit of a different breed, right? They work a little more in the black and white in some ways. And it's like, Evan, I need to know if they're an alcoholic, right? I need a yes or no. And I'm like, well, it's a little less complicated. He's like, don't give me that soft language. I need to know. Are they? I'm like, look, man, like, that's not how it works. right? I can't, I can diagnose them with a use disorder, but that's going to be on a spectrum. And just because someone necessarily may not have a use disorder doesn't mean that there's not targets that we could work on, let's say in a therapeutic sense, where chemical health is an area to work on. They could have that and not necessarily be an addict or an alcoholic. Those are not clinical terms that are used at this time. So really it is a spectrum, and there are, we have guidelines like any other disorder of how we diagnose it and how we, measure on the spectrum. And before, it used to be, like before 2013 on the DSM-5 coming out, it was, abuse or dependence. That was kind of it. And there's actually certain things I do like about that, but it was like no abuse dependence. Now it's just 1, 2, or 3, or 0. So it's just a little different how they weigh it. And I actually kind of I disagree with both in like a little, just like a little bit, but it's my opinion. But
could you speak to, because some of our listeners, whether it's themselves, a spouse, a child, someone in their life, that probably resonates and they're curious. And I bet most of us have inquired or gotten curious or wondered, does this person have an issue? And like you said, we all have a relationship with chemicals, whether it's this is my boundary or I don't. What are the diagnostic criteria? Sure. How do you know if someone has a issue?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's two ways to look at it. One is, it's a little complicated, right? There are 11 symptoms, and I'll list as many as I can off the top of my head. I don't know if I always forget a couple of them, but at least on the spot recall. But right. Also, it ain't rocket scientist, it's like Uncle Bob, right. Problem with it. There's just some people where it's like, you don't have to be a clinician with a sweater vest and, you're, the cup of tea, it's like that dude's an alcoholic. We all know that, guy, or he's a drug addict. I mean, the guy's right. Stealing cars and doing meth. It ain't right. that, complicated. Sometimes it is a little more complicated, when it's on maybe the lower ends of the spectrum, when it's more in that what we would call abuse category versus dependence. But, some of the things that we look at, for example, would be how is it impacting your relationships, right? And for all of these, we kind of look at ongoing. It's not like I got in one fight with my wife, but it's like all of these are ongoing issues more than once, right? Within more than a 1 month or something like that period. So yeah, problems in relationships. Is it affecting your work life, your ability to fulfill your responsibilities at work, home, or otherwise? Are you, how does it, there's a question of how it impacts your emotional, your mental health, your physical health. Does it have a recurring impact on that? Are you building a tolerance to the substance, which is, do you need more to get the same effect? Do you go into withdrawal? Are you giving up activities that you used to love or enjoy? What else? I mean, a lot of others are just in that vein of the negative consequences that come into your life. We used to look at legal, they kind of took that out, but recurrent legal things, I mean, you could clearly correlate that are substance related. What else? There's a handful of others, but they all kind of are on that, does it affect your emotional, mental ability to fulfill responsibilities and, just live an overall well, balanced life. And I mean, those are the specifics that we look at. And then, it's if you have 2 to 3, it's a mild symptoms. If you have, 4 to 6, it's moderate. And then you have anything over that is severe, is what's considered. I think of it like the Taco Bell sauces. Sometimes I'm mild hot, mild, medium hot. I sometimes actually accidentally say that.
Yeah, that's relatable because there's such a stigma around addiction. But like you said, this kind of permeates society. We probably all know someone, or are curious about it, or for ourselves, we have relationship with substances and chemicals. And so that's a good awareness to kind of say, where am I at? And then saying, how does it influence my home life, my work life, my physical, my mental, all of that. Those are really relatable categories or symptoms that you gave.
And I think like kind of where some of the complications come in, I think where a lot of times the traditional addiction model has got it wrong, is that like almost everyone has been there, right? I mean, it's usually like college, right? But like a very high percentage of college kids, like 30 to 40%, like meet the criteria for a use disorder,
right?
But they don't have a chronically relapsing brain disease. But if they came into my office, I could say, well, you meet the criteria of symptoms, you're doing coke and this and that. But like a lot of times it is episodic, and only a certain amount of people will that be an ongoing recurring issue at different stages of their life. And for some people, it does not come till later. Very typically with alcohol, alcohol could be a very slow burn. A lot of people, as they start approaching middle age, is when it really sinks its claws in, and it's like worse than anything else. But anywhere along the way, that could happen as well. So, I sometimes joke with people, it's like, most of us have been there, right? Like a very good amount of people had a bout, or even they had like a weird run with like some hard drugs because someone they knew, they were just in this weird situation. They found themselves like doing meth for 3 months. And if they came to me, I'd be like, oh, this is a huge, in that time, I'd be like, wow, this is a big issue. I mean, they're doing meth, right? So it is really complicated because many people have been there. And so I think a lot of people understand, or they've had experiences with something that they have struggled to control. And I find almost everybody, we all have our poisons, pick your poison. Yeah. We all have our, means of coping that may not be the healthiest, right? We've all had things that we've struggled. And so I think people could understand from that lens, where it's like, imagine that, but potentially times 10, not to like rank, because some people could have an eating disorder that in some ways may be more severe than an addiction, or someone has had a bout of that when they were a teenager, or, some people struggle to manage their eating, gambling. There's all these different, very immediately rewarding negative coping mechanisms that you could easily relate to. So sometimes I'll frame it in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. I appreciate that perspective a lot. When someone comes in and you're working with them, or even if they're hearing this and they're thinking, yeah, I can resonate, my time in college, or just even hearing that about middle age and drinking, like those statistics. What is it that makes someone, let's say me, more susceptible than you to experience maybe an issue with a substance, or let's say alcohol or dependence, and you don't? Even if we've had a similar experience, let's say in those college years, or unwind with alcohol or things like that, how does one person go down that line or that walk and end up in an addiction, whereas other people don't?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. It's like,
one word answer probably is enough.
Yeah, I'll give a one word answer is like same, like as everything else. Nature versus nurture. And I think, sometimes it gets a little political with that, where it's like, it's all trauma and adverse experiences. And the scientists like, well, it's a biological,
right.
Your genetics and that. And it's both. I mean, that's the thing with substances. It's like a Swiss Army knife of negative, like coping skills that it helps with. Right. So a lot of times, like if people are in extremely stressful situations, and that can mean a lot of different things in their life, and they're going to be more susceptible, right? And I think those are a lot of the times, the husband, I'm not trying to like genderize, but this is just like what I get all the time, but it's like husbands who are, using too much of COVID, and a lot of women as well. But, so there's the stress. So there's the stress of the present, and then there's the stress of the past, right? Of the developmental traumas adverse, the more you have, in many ways, you're more likely. But then addiction is notorious for affecting everybody, right? It does not discriminate.
Right.
And so you have a lot of people, let's say like myself, honestly, who didn't have a ton of like adverse childhood experiences. So why the hell did it hit me so hard, right? And there's like the biological, and it wasn't even genetic, but in some ways it is. But I think there's certain, and people may argue this, like, but personality types, right, that are going to be more susceptible. Like, for example, like I have found in my own personal observation, a lot of the folks who have these ongoing issues, especially from a young age, have like ADHD, or they have some kind of neuroatypical thing going on, right, where they struggle with impulse control.
Wow.
And in substances just do something different for them, because they have just a different mental setup where substances kind of fit like a puzzle very well. So I think there's just some people, right, like take for my brother, he likes to have a good time, but it just didn't hit him the same way. Like there's just different elements of our personality. We have the same upbringing, same parents, a lot of this similar genetics, but for whatever reason, like I just went down that route. There's damn near nothing I could have done about it just because of how I'm wired. How substances, I mean, it was clear from a young age that they affect me. They do something different for me than someone else. One of the like anecdotes I use is I say a healthy relationship with chemicals is like, this is something I do once in a while for fun. Mm-hmm. Where people go down the rabbit hole is when it becomes a tool for something specific, right? This is the way I cope with stress. Right? A lot of people do that. They have a glass of wine, and they're able to manage to a certain degree, but that's one example of like, this is the one thing, right? When you become reliant on it, this is what I use to numb pain, painkillers, whatever. This is what I do to cope, emotionally with trauma from the past. This is what I use is solely a means to have fun. I got nothing else that I do except like, this is what I rely on, not just a, auxiliary tool to do it once in a while. And you could just go down the line, but whenever you use substances for something specific, that's where it becomes a trap.
Yeah.
Because then you have, the evil of tolerance. And I always joke too. So tolerance, right, is it's I need more to get the same effect, but then when I stop doing it, it feels worse, right? Then I go into withdrawal. So then I need more, right? So whenever you start getting in that cycle, it is hard to break. And some people find themselves able to break it and they're like, gosh, I learned my lesson and I don't do it, and they move on with their lives. They're still in the same cycle as the more chronic addict. So that's why it is hard a lot of times to tell the difference of what is an appropriate intervention, because I don't know, these folks are in the same washing machine, right? I don't know which one is going to be able to get out and not go back into it, because it looks very much, now there's some indicators that I look for that kind of give me a hint to it. But sometimes it is hard to tell. And that's why in the zeitgeist or whatever, it's just kind of that black and white. Are they an alcoholic? Or are they not an alcoholic? Where it's, the real question is, are they a chronic addict, or is this going to be an issue ongoing almost no matter what you do or not, right? I think that's a bigger question, because at the end of the day, when somebody comes for an assessment, which is really one of the first steps you want to take, is at the end of the day, I'm just making a recommendation for different levels of care. And that could be anything from, hey, why don't you, nothing really, to, hey, let's see me once a week and let's see where this goes, and we'll set up some goals and see how we do. And if we need more, we could just kind of up it from there. To, hey, you need to go to detox right now because your hands are shaking and I'm worried you may have a seizure, right? So it really spans a wide. So the question is, what are you most appropriate for? And, someone who's saying, okay, yeah, I'm back in the using cycle. However, I've been to like 10 treatments before and I'm doing opiates. It's like, okay, we're not going to do that. Hey, let's meet once a week and work on some of your goals. It's like, we need, this is more entrenched and more chronic. So I don't remember the original question. I tend to go on rants, but
yeah, no, that's really helpful to give people an idea of what therapy or what treatment options are out there. And I think a lot of us, we think of addictions, we think of addiction treatment facility or detox or rehab. But what does therapy, like, let's say you do an assessment and you decide, okay, this person meets the criteria that probably once a week for psychotherapy would be really good. What does that look like? What does that look like?
That's a good question. I almost have like a little formula that I do with these folks. And one of the first things I do is I work with them on motivation, right? So really identifying what is your motivation to stop using and how do we enhance that? One of the ways we enhance is we talk about it more and really examine why do you want to do this and what are the positives you're going for and what are the negatives you're trying to avoid? Because it's important to always remember those because, when the going gets tough and that substance is in front of you, right, your mind has a great way of trying to convince you to do that immediate pleasure right now. So really trying to ingrain that motivation because it takes just, going over that line of I want to do this to then form a plan. All right, so then we come up with a plan. And part of that plan is identifying, I use I call it like the stoplight model, where it's like red, yellow, green. And the red is like, here's where I do not go. These are the most damaging behaviors. And it's basically the relapse, or if I do this, I'm coming close to relapse, right? Stepping foot in a bar. But the red is drinking. Right now, I'm not going to drink. The yellow, here are all the things that will probably lead to drinking that I want to avoid. I may find myself kind of in the zone. But when I recognize that, that's when I get out of the zone, right? These are all things that just help build awareness. And then the green are probably the most important. Here are the positive, healthy things that I want to do. I want to get back into working out. All right. So, all right, how often, then doing kind of the SMART goals of, all right, how often do you want to work out, right? How do you want to go on walks? Do you want to, even doing therapy? That is an example of a green. Here are the changes that I'm going to make. It could even be things like replacement behaviors, or you could do this with like anything. You do it with smoking. All right, I'm going to drink tea instead after a meal, right? So these are all things you could put. So we identify that because one of the biggest things with making any behavioral change is awareness, right? Being aware, because all these things exist in your head, but everything in your head is floating back there. So you're kind of like, so let's get it on paper. Let's have this visualized and have an organized plan. The third element is accountability. And that is where therapy comes in, right? It's if we're meeting every week and every week we're going to check in. I'm going to be asking you about your little stoplight there and what you did. And, when you do that, people are going to be more likely because they don't want to come in and not do their homework. This is a little awkward, right? And itself. It's like a lot of times how DBT works, where like you go in, it's like if you have to do your thought chain analysis if you had a self-harm incident or something like that. And it's like, no one wants to do the thought, it's annoying, so, there's that accountability. And I try to get them to set up accountability in other ways, whether it's with the spouse, but eventually the goal is that you could have a sense of accountability with yourself. But it always does help to have accountability in as many, I call it like layers of accountability. And kind of the joke is like, look, if like in the most extreme sense, like imagine if like I had access to your bank account. And not only that, so if you relapse, I get all your money, right? Not only that, I'm going to have a security guard with you 24/7 at all times. And if you they have a cattle prod and they're going to shock you right in the butt, right? You're not going to use, right? It could be even more extreme, like, I'm going to kill you. So whoever that is, even like the most dire of heroin addicts, like, aren't going to do it because they have this just insane level of accountability, but that's not realistic. How can we find realistic measures where you have these incentives and maybe even disincentives? Incentives are more powerful, but setting up, also these layers of accountability so that you're just more likely to maintain that behavior change. And especially at the beginning, that's when it's the hardest. Our minds adjust pretty quick
Right.
to making changes. And then there's all sorts of ongoing complications of maintaining those changes, which is a little trickier. But so like right off the bat, those are like the first two things we do. Everything else kind of gets into therapy zone of, looking at, core beliefs and learning skills of how to reframe negative thoughts and, all the greatest hits. We kind of get into therapy mode, because one of the most important things is like we need to set a foundation of, if you're actively engaging in like very problematic substance use, it's really hard to do the deeper work, right? So it's kind of like, all right, we're just going to stop the pipe from just shooting water all over the basement. So, we're just going to like patch it up, clean it up so that we could work on the rest of the house. It's like I'm trying to remodel a house and decorate it. Meanwhile, the basement is just flooding with sewage water.
Right.
It doesn't really work all that well, depending on how bad it is. So, so those are kind of, that's like the therapeutic model. And I try to teach that to therapists that aren't addiction, because I think, as complicated as addiction is, therapists are afraid to touch it.
Yeah.
Right? And I see why. However, I think for those who are in mild or moderate zone, depending, where maybe it's not as complicated, maybe it's just more of a negative coping pattern, that if they could learn, how to use something like that, right, or apply it to other behaviors they know, that, they shouldn't be too afraid of it, right? Maybe it takes a little practice, you have some consultation, but I really think every therapist could and should have some of those skills to be able to treat them mild to moderate. If they get someone more severe, just like anything else, like I'm somewhat comfortable with everything, like OCD, but like, if it is like a primary and severe, there's some of those things where I'm like, I'm just not the best person for the job. Like I know what DBT, I know what the tenets of, prolonged, exposure type stuff, and I could implement that, right? But there's certain things that do require a specialist, but it's not everyone, because as you know, from a private practice therapist, and this was one of the things that shocked me, is I don't know who the hell was walking into my office.
Right.
Like, it's kind of like being the general practitioner at like a small town rural hospital. Like, I got to know how to like sew up and not like,
right.
And sometimes like you just never know. And it's shy, because I always thought like, I'll probably get them less acute, maybe more depression, anxiety, the working well, but no, you get some like, sometimes you're that front line, even though they're in your nice little office with the nice little decorations in the they may be in like a really tough, complicated spot, and you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us, as therapists, to have like a general, broad understanding of a lot of these things. And another reason too is just like there's not enough therapists, and like I see a lot of therapists are like, and having anything like greater than like mild depression or anxiety, like, I need to especially the newer ones. And I get that, but maybe it's better to get some consultation and learn something, use this as a learning opportunity. But yeah, I think addiction, you just cannot avoid it. You can't just keep referring out, and maybe you can, and but there's so few of us, and especially specialists, their schedule gets full.
The wait lists. Yeah.
Yeah. When doing the social media work I do, I get to read tens of thousands of comments from people who are just out there, right? And they live in different areas, they're all over the world. And one of the biggest issues is either I can't afford it or I don't have access to it. And probably a lot of people have access to it, and they just don't know how to act. They just don't know how to navigate the complicated system, right? So few people are even able to get resources. So, how as therapists can we, stay in our lane, but widen it at least a little bit. So, at least give it a shot. And, like I have a client recently where he and I, really started to, they were really, we'll just call it an overactivated nervous system, right? Where just, I don't know, what they would used to call neuroses back in the day. I love that term. I don't know. It's brings back. I think it's because I'm a Jew and like that's the term is in our vernacular. I wonder what the Yiddish word is, but like just really struggling with a lot of daily tasks are really hard, and and then we started to realize after working, it's like this really seems a lot like OCD and not just regular anxiety. And I was like, I could refer you to an outpatient program, a specialist. We're doing some good work, but let's give it a shot first, right? I know at least a little bit about it, and I'm a real advocate of things like workbooks. I'm like, why don't you just like find a good 5-star workbook on Amazon, do it. We'll go over some of it together. We'll see if you can make improvements, and if not, maybe we'll do a bit of an outpatient program or something like that. If you're not getting quote better, if your symptoms are not improving, just like anything else medical, we all have a treatment plan and we have goals. And if objectively, if it's not working, then let's then maybe have you see a specialist versus just being like,
right.
next.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think addiction is that one that especially new therapists don't want to touch. Like it's a scary animal almost, but I loved how you broke it down into the green light, red light, or green light, yellow light, red light, like the stoplight analogy. That is so beneficial to think about. And I think you can apply that to a lot of other behaviors and things in mental health, but just that motivational interviewing, the stages of change, and just goal setting, working with people, that accountability, that you're a safe place and they have that place to go to every week. That's reassuring in and of itself. If I'm going to have stress at work or in my relationship, and my inkling or my impulse is to say, I want to go to the bottle. But to know, oh, wait, I'm going to see my therapist this week on Thursday, or that will feel really good, especially when you start to get some of the positive reward of it, of just being with someone or feeling validated, feeling heard. And then you experience a positive coping mechanism and the offloading. It's like, okay, I can, distress tolerance increases. Oh, positive reward here increases. And it's not going to be a 1-week thing, but just that beautiful relationship over time, I think is so valuable.
Yeah, and exactly. And I use that model for everything. Like, I mean, I use that, like every new client, I actually do the exact same thing. It just looks a little bit different because we all have, I call them internal boundaries, right? We all know about boundaries, which is like, okay, this is, I'm setting a boundary with you or with my boss or other people, like, there's a big push for that, but I'm like, these are internal boundaries. These are limits that you set with yourself, and we all need to have them. And we all need to just, to meet our goals, just push ourselves a little bit, right? We don't go over the window of we're just going to, slowly try to expand what we're comfortable with. And so I use it for pretty much I think it's beneficial. But for addiction, it's like a little, it's got a little bit more of an emphasis. Sometimes it's life or death. But yeah, exactly. So I think it is a good kind of wide tool that you could use. And you're right about with the positive enforcement. And usually, almost always, people get services not because they're like, I want the positive. They want the positive, but they're like, my ass is on fire.
Right.
They come in and there's smoke, coming from behind them, and that is a, legal issue, and they're really feeling trapped in a corner. And that could be emotional too. They're like, I'm just freaking miserable, right? So they come in because of the consequences and the punishment. It's like, come for that, but stay for the positive elements. And so what sometimes is a conundrum for people is, often, whether I do anything or not, naturally the fire is going to go out and you're going to heal up a little bit. I try to, the interventions help move that forward faster. But, it's like just like anything, like a crisis. Rahm Emanuel say it's like never, always take advantage of a crisis, never let a good crisis go to waste, because this is an opportunity. It's a wake-up call to make changes, because very soon, I tell them, very soon your life is going to start to like tilt back to normal. But if you don't make changes, the crisis is going to come again. If you don't fix the inherent issues, right, you're going to very likely be back here again. So let's make some of these changes now so that that doesn't happen, so that you don't get another DWI. That'd be a great example of, oh man, I got a DWI and I got to get an assessment. I lost my license. It's cost me $10,000. I got to blow in a tube. But then eventually you pay the money and your life kind of goes back to normal and it becomes the new normal. And if you just keep doing what you're doing, it's very likely to happen again. So I think it's the positive. It's like the positive effects of recovery, the rewards are what motivate people long time. The punishment gets you in the door, but it won't keep. I mean, there are some rare people who, get so freaked out, or they just got brought to such a place where they just shut the door and they're done. They don't even have to make that. They're just like, I'm done. Some people can do that. I mean, it's not the best plan for everybody to just be like, all right, well, you had some horrible consequences. You're good to go. And just remember those, because our minds forget very quickly, because our brains trick us to take the reward that's right in front of us to self-soothe now. And it just becomes, it's kind of that, like, people like personify it as like the devil on your shoulder. People call it slick. Right. It's the part of your mind that says we need to take care of this thing now. And it gives you all these reasons why. And you want to do it so bad because you know how good you're going to feel. But then you don't think about how that's going to affect you, and you're literally almost incapable of thinking about how bad it was before. You kind of put lipstick on the pig. Like, oh, wasn't that bad? That's the long-term mental game. That's what makes recovery so hard in the long term and relapse so high. Often for people who have a significant amount of recovery and they're not necessarily craving it all the time, they just I call it a relapse of negligence, right? Mm-hmm. There was no fight. There was no passion. It was just like, well, I used to always drink whiskey, and it got bad, but I never tried just drinking beer, right? And so like any outsider who's like your life was just an absolute mess, like, how could you even think to do this? But like when you're in that mental space, like you're basically in a space of mild insanity, essentially, when you're close to that relapse, depending on how bad it was before. But even the people who was extremely severe, they come up with these anecdotes or whatever and justifications, rationalizations to open that door again, to open the floodgates of here's how it's going to be different this time. And some people can do that, right? It maybe works for a small percentage of people who are less severe, but more often than not, that leads people back into that same cycle because they forget how bad it was. So I think that's why like certain programs that have accountability, things like AA, NA, other community support programs, or even just doing like ongoing therapy for years, right? You remember how bad it is. You remember how good, the benefits of recovery are that you become so used to and then eventually take for granted, right? That awareness piece. That's why people like often relapse. It's more about mental negligence and not in passion, right? I call the other one a relapse of passion. And that's the one most people think about, where it's like, oh, I'm craving it. Oh, my boss, it's like this stressful. I got broken up with, and like, screw it, God, I'm drinking anyway, and that happens often in like early recovery where you just don't have the coping skills, or it just doesn't seem worth it because of how bad you feel, or your cravings are just so bad. But really in the long term, more people tend to relapse out of, they call it the mental twist back in the old days, back in the old AA days, they call it a peculiar mental twist that brings people back after a long period of time.
So would you suggest someone, I know this is such a personalized question, but how often then would someone be in therapy? Like, could it be lifelong? Would it be weekly? Would it spread out? What does that often look like, or social support?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess it depends on the individual about what they want, about, so like a typical, let's say, your run of the mill person who I think is appropriate for outpatient therapy to work on managing their chemical health. I like to start out once a week. Maybe we do that for a few months. Some people like to see me once a week for a very long time. Often we then go to every other week. Usually from there, there's not many people I see once a month, but there are some people I recommend that for who don't have a lot of other accountability. They're not in a community support program. So sometimes with those people, I think it's actually a benefit, knowing that you're going to see your therapist in a month, because people often backslide in the old behaviors. And if they come in, sometimes a therapist could be like, hey, like, I'm concerned, I could see this. And then they're like, oh, you know what, you're right. I'm like, all right, let's get back. And sometimes it's like, let's maybe, as we get through this next phase or a crisis that came up or whatever, we can see each other a little bit more and then go back. So people who don't have any support or accountability, sometimes I would say, honestly, I feel like it could be a benefit to see someone once every 6 months, because of making a significant behavioral change, to have any type of accountantability and check,
Right.
and, like a little tune-up.
Right. Yeah. How we do with our cars.
I always like think of therapy like massage therapy, right? Because sometimes maybe you really need it, like it's the best intervention for getting your muscles worked on or whatever. But every once in a while, people are like, well, I don't know if I need it. It's like, well, I don't always need a Swedish massage, but I walk away feeling better, and it's an element of self-care, right?
Yeah.
So therapy could serve different purposes. It doesn't always have to be like falling off a cliff. Now, maybe insurance won't pay for it.
Right.
Just like a good chat with someone supportive. But I think there's just different benefits and different reasons people seek support services.
Mm-hmm. And just that mental health support. So where can our listeners find you? You said you really like to put out social media content, which would be so helpful, because just as you've been describing these different areas of addiction and kind of letting us into your world, it's so fascinating. And I've learned so much. So I'm sure our listeners would love to follow along with you and continue to learn more. I think that's such a beautiful thing to be doing, because it permeates all of us. And so we get to learn more, and knowledge is power.
Yeah. So my biggest platform is TikTok. And you can find me at Evan the Counselor. So Evan.the.counselor. If you put that in, you'll find me. But I also have longer form YouTube content. And then Instagram, I just kind of post the stuff I make for other stuff. But some people just don't like TikTok, or don't know what the heck it is. So so you can find me on Instagram, where I post some of the same content too. I try to do some similar educational type content, and just try to make it entertaining and more engaging than me just kind of sitting and talking. I do some I do a lot of comedy on there too, mental health comedy stuff. So check it out if you want.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes. I think that just normalizes it, and it makes it less scary, especially anything addiction or substances can be really scary and taboo and stigmatized. So I love that you're putting this stuff out there. I love that you're using humor, and just really, again, just thank you for describing it and being able to do that for us. That's so beneficial.
Well, you may want to check out my content before you start saying any good things. You may watch it.
Well, I'm talking about our conversation today. I'm one of those people who don't have TikTok, but
I want to open that can of worms.
Right. I love working with my younger university clients, because they're like, so do you know what Instagram is? Like, not that old. I'm a mom, but TikTok, I don't know, actually. I mean, obviously I know of it. I'm just not on there, but I will.
Yeah, no, that's very common for us, for a lot of millennials, who are like, right. What is this TikTok business? But I mean, I think it's odd. There's a lot of good stuff. There's some really good mental health. I think compared to any of the other social media, I think TikTok has the best mental health professionals making content. There's a wide variety, and it's more palatable than watching a whole YouTube video. There's plenty of people who do it. I've seen some of them, but with TikTok, it's just so much more fun. I mean, some of it is just very educational. and if you download the app, it learns pretty quick what you like. So you could search for those hashtags and and it'll start throwing all of us at you. And you could see who you like of people, there's psychiatrists, there's, pharmacists. I mean, there's so much to learn on there. You just gotta be careful because it's a little addicting. But that's because honestly, the content is that good. I mean, and it's not like super complicated, well produced stuff. It's like some of it is just people talking, but some of the bigger creators have learned how to be engaging and grab your attention. But you could also, but it's also, some of it is nutritious, where you're learning some real stuff. Yeah. And I think it incentivizes people. It's like, if consuming this important, nutritious content is fun, then all the better. I mean, the more you're going to learn. So so just like approach with caution. But I think a lot of people, like everyone who gets on TikTok, they get addicted for a while, right? And it's kind of like that addiction thing, but eventually they kind of burn out. So it's like, just like pace yourself with it, because otherwise it's going to consume your life. You're going to be up to 3 a.m. and then you're going to burn out and just like put it away forever. But, just pace yourself with it. And I think it's awesome.
Oh, I've heard really good things. So I am considering checking it out. And again, it was so valuable to have you on today, Evan. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, your wisdom and expertise. And we really just are very appreciative of you. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me and giving me a little escape. And now it's Monday and I'm like, oh God, what fresh hell am I going to have to?
Yeah.
I love what I do, and I'm excited to get back on the grind today.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Evan. Our team will be in touch when it's coming out, and we can link to you and everything like that.
Yeah, let me know. It'd be cool. And I could share as well on some of my socials and promote it a little bit, and on the website, all that good stuff. So
yes, thank you. So evan.the.counselor.
There you go. That's it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, Evan.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.